Bum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum.
Welcome to Everyday Musicality, the podcast in which we discuss all things related to Gordon's music learning theory and how it can help unlock the inner musician that lives inside of all of us. I'm your host, Heather Shouldice, music educator and faculty member for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. In this episode, we focus on tonal skills learned at the verbal association level of the skill learning sequence. Hello and welcome to the Everyday Musicality podcast. I'm sorry it's been a while since I've posted a new episode. We've gotten to that crazy point in our semester, and also I was going back for another round of physical therapy that didn't work for some back pain that I've been having for several years now that no one can seem to help me with. So I was going to physical therapy 3 times a week to see if this new physical therapist could help me, and unfortunately, he couldn't. So now I'm done with that physical therapy, and I have a little more time in my weekly schedule to get back to recording episodes for you. Today, I'm continuing the mini-series of episodes focused on the verbal association skill level. Back in episode 41, I provided an introduction to the verbal association level. Then, since verbal association is the point at which we begin using tonal and rhythm solfege in MLT, in episode 42, I talked about the various tonal and rhythm syllable systems available and why MLT practitioners tend to use movable do with la bass minor for tonal solfege and beat function-based syllables for rhythm. Next, in today's episode, I'm going to talk about the tonal skills learned at the verbal association skill level. Remember that back at the oral level, the tonal skills we focused on were singing the resting tone on a neutral syllable, echoing tonal patterns on neutral syllables, recognizing familiar tonal patterns within a song, and singing the first or last pitch of a pattern or song on a neutral syllable. Once students have developed those skills at oral with certain content, they experience the same content at the verbal association level with the addition of tonal solfege. Also, students learn to use solfege as a tool for naming familiar tonalities and tonal pattern functions at the verbal association level. And remember, since verbal association is a level of discrimination learning, the teacher should make sure to model the skill that you're teaching before asking students to perform the skill. If you're newer to MLT and aren't familiar with the term discrimination learning, or if you just want a quick overview of the skill learning sequence in MLT, check out episode 9. I'll link to that in the show notes. So let's get into tonal skills learned at the verbal association skill level. First is singing resting tone on solfege. I talked about teaching students to sing resting tone on a neutral syllable back in episode 34, which focused on tonal skills learned at the oral skill level. I'll link to that episode in the show notes in case you'd like to go back and review it. Now, at the verbal association level, students' audiation of tonal context is further developed by learning to associate a solfege syllable to the resting tone in a familiar tonality. Also, as students learn to sing the resting tone with solfege, they learn to name tonalities by recognizing their resting tones. So, for example, if students have learned to audiate and sing the resting tone on a neutral syllable in major and minor tonalities at the oral level, now at verbal association, they'll sing those resting tones with solfege and use the syllable to start labeling the tonality as major or minor. Here's an example. Mi, fa, mi, re, do, ti, si, la. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ya-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Yum-ba-da-dum-bum, bum, 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 la. Ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, la, ba-da-da-dum, bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, la, ba-da-da-dum, la, ba-dum, ba-da-dum, la, bum. When the song stopped, I sang la. Try that with me. La. When we're audiating la as the resting tone, the song is in minor tonality. Sing minor tonality. Minor tonality. And when we're in minor tonality, the resting tone is la. This time, whenever my song stops, take a breath with me and sing that pitch. La. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum. La. Ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. La. Bum, bum. La. Ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum. La. Ba-dum, ba-da-dum. La. Bum. Yum, ba-da-dum, bum. Bum. And when the resting tone of the song is la, the song is in what? Minor tonality. Because in minor tonality, the resting tone is la. That's right. So let's talk about that process a little bit. First, I established tonality, this time on solfege. At aural, we established tonality on neutral syllables. Ya-da-da-da-da-da-dum. And now that we're at verbal association, we establish on solfege. Mi, fa, mi, re, do, ti, si, la. Remember that establishing tonality is important because it helps prepare students to audiate the tonal context of the song. We don't always establish tonality first. For example, if we wanted students to independently identify the tonality of an unfamiliar melody at the generalization skill level, we wouldn't establish the tonality for them because we would want them to figure it out for themselves. But at the verbal association skill level, we do establish tonality for students, now with solfege instead of neutral syllables like at aural. Also notice that I modeled the resting tone with solfege before I asked you to sing the resting tone with solfege. Again, this is because verbal association is a level of discrimination learning, so we need to make sure we model the skill before expecting students to perform it. If you simply said to them, sing the resting tone of my song, and you didn't model it for them before you prompted them to respond, then they would be forced to make an inference by independently identifying the resting tone. Remember that in discrimination learning, students should be recognizing, not identifying. So be sure to model the resting tone with solfege for students. In addition to modeling the singing of the resting tone with solfege, I also modeled associating the name of the tonality to that resting tone syllable. I didn't explain why, I didn't talk about the minor scale or half steps and whole steps or anything theoretical. I simply said, when we're audiating la as the resting tone, that means we're audiating in minor tonality. We simply started associating the name minor tonality to the resting tone la. We would do the same thing in major tonality by associating the name major tonality to the resting tone do. So that's the skill of teaching students to sing the resting tone with solfege and use that solfege syllable of the resting tone to start naming the tonality. In addition to simply having students sing the resting tone with solfege whenever you pause and gesture during a song, there are lots of fun ways to reinforce this skill of singing resting tone with solfege. You could sing a song while balancing a beanbag on a part of your body and moving it with continuous fluid movement, and then drop it and sing the resting tone with solfege when it hits the floor. Or you could pause between phrases of a song to blow a bubble using bubble solution, and then model taking a breath and singing the resting tone with solfege as you pop the bubble. Then you could blow bubbles for individual students to pop and sing the resting tone with solfege in between phrases of the song. Remember that individual response is so important for building students' musical independence and for assessment, both for students to hear themselves and for you to hear them individually so you can gauge their progress. I give lots more ideas for resting tone activities and for assessment and lots more in my book, which was recently published by sponsor GIA Publications. It's called Weaving It All Together, a practical guide to applying Gordon's music learning theory in the elementary general music program. I'll link to that in the show notes, as well as to a previous episode, number 30, in which I gave an overview of what's in the book in case you'd like to know what's in it. So there are all kinds of playful ways in which you can reinforce and practice audiating and singing the resting tone with solfege. And here's where I would like to try something new on the podcast, a listener idea or listener suggestion episode. If you have a favorite way that you like to teach or reinforce the resting tone, maybe a fun activity or a game or a prop that you like to use, please send me a brief description in an email or a voice memo to everydaymusicality@gmail.com, and I'll share it in an upcoming episode, giving you credit, of course. Let's look at the next tonal skill that is practiced at the verbal association level, which is echoing tonal patterns on solfege. Remember that the skill of singing tonal patterns is important because it helps students develop a tonal content vocabulary. Just as young children build a vocabulary of words to use in communicating with language, a vocabulary of tonal patterns serves as the musical building blocks to help students develop their tonal audiation and communicate their own musical thoughts. Then they can connect that tonal pattern vocabulary to the repertoire they're learning, which is part of the whole-part-whole process in music learning theory. I talked about that whole-part-whole learning process back in episode 5, which I'll link to in the show notes. So teaching tonal patterns with solfege can be pretty simple. Mi, fa, mi, re, do, ti, si, la. Be my echo. La, do, mi. Mi, re, ti, si. Ti, si, mi. Do, la. Do, mi, la. Ti, si, mi. Mi, si, ti. La, mi. So just like with teaching resting tone with solfege, I started by establishing tonality and notice again that it was on solfege because we're at the verbal association skill level. After I established tonality, I asked you to echo and perform short tonal patterns with solfege in the given context. Those tonal patterns were arpeggiations of tonic and dominant chords, and each pattern included 2, 3, or 4 pitches. Notice that just like with resting tone, there's a slight pause before prompting students to sing, and then you would model a clear breath with a gesture to indicate to students to breathe and echo the pattern. There are learning sequence activity pages designed to focus on the skill of echoing tonal patterns with solfege, and after teaching some group patterns, you can move on to inviting individual students to echo tonal patterns with solfege in solo. Once students have experienced echoing tonal patterns with solfege in learning sequence activities, there are a variety of ways in which the skill of singing tonal patterns with solfege can be practiced through classroom activities. One simple way is to sing patterns for students to echo in between repetitions of a song that they're working on. Additionally, classroom activities can incorporate props or games to engage students and encourage singing of tonal patterns with solfege. For example, you might have students move ribbon wands or fabric streamers with continuous fluid movement while singing a song in the given context. Then, after each repetition of the song, you could pretend the handle of the streamer is a microphone and sing tonal patterns with solfege for students to echo into their pretend microphones. Again, I would love to do a future episode sharing listener suggestions, so please email or message me on Facebook your favorite activity ideas for getting students to echo tonal patterns with solfege, and I would love to feature your suggestion in a future episode. Another important skill for students to learn at the verbal association skill level is to label and recognize the harmonic function of familiar tonal patterns they're hearing or performing with solfege. If you follow Gordon's tonal content learning sequence, this would begin with tonic and dominant functions in major and minor tonalities. So in major tonality, the students learn that a major tonic pattern includes the pitches do, mi, or so, while a dominant pattern includes the pitches so, ti, re, or fa. Similarly, students learn that in minor tonality, a tonic pattern includes la, do, or mi, while a dominant pattern includes mi, si, ti, or re. To teach the skill of labeling and recognizing functions of familiar tonal patterns at the verbal association level, you could do something like this. Mi, fa, mi, re, do, ti, si, la. When the resting tone is la, that tells us we are audiating in what? Minor tonality. In minor tonality, there's all different kinds of patterns, and we're going to start by learning about one special kind of pattern called minor tonic. Say minor tonic. Minor tonic. A minor tonic pattern includes a combination of the pitches la, do, mi, and nothing else. If a pattern in minor tonality includes the pitches la, do, mi, and nothing else, that pattern is a minor tonic. What's in a minor tonic pattern? La, do, mi, and nothing else. And if a pattern in minor is a combination of la, do, or mi, and nothing else, what kind of pattern is it? Minor tonic. Now I'm going to sing some patterns in minor tonality, and your job is to tell me whether each pattern is minor tonic or not. If you hear a combination of la, do, or mi, and nothing else, your job is to sing back minor tonic. Try that. Minor tonic. If you hear anything other than la, do, or mi, you're going to sing no up high. Try that. No. Let's try some. I'll start with an easy one. La, do, mi. Minor tonic. And why was that a minor tonic? Because it was a combination of la, do, mi, and nothing else. How about this one? Mi, do, la. Minor tonic. And how did we know it was minor tonic? Because it was a combination of la, do, mi, and nothing else. Let's try another one. Let's try si, ti, mi. No, that was not a minor tonic because we didn't just hear la, do, or mi. There was other stuff. How about this one? Mi, la. Minor tonic. Yep, even though it didn't have do, it was still a combination of la, do, or mi, and nothing else. How about this one? Mi, re, ti. No, that was not minor tonic. You're right. Let's go a little quicker now. Mi, la, do. Minor tonic. Mi, do. Minor tonic. Re, ti, si. No. Mi, la. Minor tonic. And if our resting tone is la, what tonality are we in? Minor tonality. And how do we know if a pattern is a minor tonic? If it has a combination of la, do, mi, and nothing else. So that's the basic process. And then when students are getting the hang of minor tonic on either the same day or a subsequent day, depending on how well the students are doing, you would use a similar process to teach minor dominant as a combination of mi, si, ti, re. You would also introduce major tonic and dominant functions using a similar process. Sol, la, sol, fa, mi, re, ti, do. So you would teach students that in major tonality, we know the resting tone is do. And a major tonic pattern is a combination of do, mi, so, and nothing else. Once students had the hang of that, we would label major dominant as a combination of so, ti, re, or fa, and nothing else. And we would practice then labeling major tonic or no. And once students had the hang of that, we would label major tonic or major dominant. A quick note about teaching those arpeggiations when you're getting students to start labeling pattern function. Most teachers have students learn the arpeggiation do, mi, so for major tonic. That's pretty standard. And then a lot of teachers will use sol, fa, re, ti as the starting place for teaching major dominant. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's accurate. But I find that students have an easier time later on learning what a chord root means if you build up from the root. So that's why when I introduce tonic and dominant, in major I introduce the dominant as so, ti, re, fa. I arpeggiate up from the root, because then later on, when I mention what chord roots mean, I can point out that we are building up from the root of the chord. And it just helps things sink in a little bit more for the students. Again, if you teach it as so, fa, re, ti, there's nothing at all wrong with that. I'm just sharing that there's a little added bonus if you teach it as arpeggiating up from the root. So, ti, re, fa. If you're looking for more advice on how to teach students to recognize and label tonal pattern function, Gordon's Reference Handbook for Using Learning Sequence Activities includes sample instructions to give to students. The first unit of Learning Sequence Activities, or LSAs as we call them in MLT world, the first unit focuses on tonic and dominant in major and minor at the aural level, and then the second unit takes that same set of patterns and moves them to the verbal association skill level. The patterns themselves are found in the tonal register book, and all the instructions for how to teach the LSAs can be found in the reference handbook. I'll link to all those materials in the show notes. Also, since we're on the topic of LSAs and verbal association, a side note, if you're a seasoned MLT teacher and you've taught LSAs before, you might be wondering why the pages in the second unit are ordered the way they are for verbal association. In the first unit, at the aural level, it starts with 3 pages in major, singing the first pitch of the patterns, singing the resting tone in response to patterns, and echoing the patterns on neutral syllables. Then, there are 3 pages where students practice those same skills in minor. Next, all of those pages are repeated in Unit 2 with solfege at the verbal association level, but first, Unit 2 starts with 2 pages where students learn to recognize and label tonic and dominant functions in major and then in minor. In my work teaching professional development levels courses for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning, I have heard many folks ask why the second tonal LSA unit starts with labeling pattern function. The answer is that Gordon put the function labeling pages first in the verbal association LSAs so that students would have an opportunity to hear solfege before they have to sing the solfege themselves. So by labeling pattern function, this bathes the students in the sounds of solfege syllables without making them actually produce the solfege syllables themselves. Now, I think that is a valid reason for why students don't start with singing tonal patterns with solfege in Tonal Unit 2. However, those function labeling pages are pretty hard. If you teach those LSA pages in the order that they are in the books, students have so much new information to take in and retain in those first tonal pages at verbal association. They have to learn that major tonality is when the resting tone is do, and then they have to learn to recognize what pitches are in the tonic and the dominant functions, as well as remembering the labels major tonic and major dominant. It's a lot. When I was teaching kids, I came up with a different ordering of the pages that I felt was a good compromise. Once my students had finished Tonal Unit 1 at aural, I would jump to the resting tone pages from Tonal Unit 2. I would use those resting tone pages to introduce tonality names in major and minor tonality and associate those tonality names with the resting tone syllable so that the students only had to sing back the resting tone with solfege. This seemed like a reasonable compromise because the students were only singing that one syllable for the resting tone, but they were still getting to hear a lot of patterns with solfege. Plus, it made life so much easier when we then went back and did the function labeling pages because then the kids were already familiar with the term major tonality and they could associate that with the resting tone syllable. And so all we had to do at that point was to add the pattern functions from there. So don't be afraid to experiment with the order in which you teach learning sequence activities. Also, if you're newer to MLT and are wondering what the heck learning sequence activities even are, I talk about that back in episode 26. I'll link to that in the show notes. So back to labeling pattern function. After you've introduced tonic and dominant in major or in minor in a focused way, like in LSAs, you can then have students practice recognizing tonic and dominant function patterns in classroom activities that are more playful. For example, I love to do a game with the song Hello Everybody from Jump Right In Book 1, where we walk around the room to the macro beat while singing the song and then find a partner by the end of the song. When the song is done, the kids listen to my tonal patterns that I sing with solfege, and if they hear a major tonic pattern, they sing it back and shake hands with their partner while they sing the pattern. Or in COVID times, they could elbow bump their partner as they echo the pattern. If the pattern I sing is not a major tonic, the students still sing it, but they don't shake or elbow bump with their partner. However, they can try to fake their partner out to see if they fall for it or whether they're paying attention. So we alternate between singing the song and walking to the macro beat, finding a partner and then echoing a few patterns with solfege, and shaking or elbow bumping on tonic, and just echoing and trying to fake out their partner on dominant. Once the kids get the hang of that, we add in a high five with their partner when they echo major dominant patterns with solfege, or in COVID times, it could be a toe tap with their partner. So we alternate between walking to the macro beats while we sing the song, and then echoing patterns with solfege with a partner, shaking or elbow bumping on tonic, and high-fiving or toe tapping on dominant. In addition to performing tonal patterns with solfege and labeling their function, connections could be made between familiar patterns and song repertoire by recognizing where a particular tonal pattern occurs within a song. This is another important component of the final whole within the whole part whole learning process, in which students apply their audiation skills and pattern vocabulary to their performance and understanding of repertoire. To teach the skill of orally recognizing a familiar tonal pattern with solfege within a familiar song at the verbal association level, you might do something like this. Mi, fa, mi, re, do, ti, si, la. Right now our resting tone is la, so we are audiating in what tonality? Minor tonality, that's right. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ya-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Be my echo, la, mi. What kind of pattern is that? La, mi. Is it minor tonic or minor dominant? La, mi is a minor tonic because it's a combination of what? La, do, mi, and nothing else. So what kind of pattern is la, mi? Minor tonic, right? Now that pattern, la, mi, happens somewhere in my song. Listen again and see if you could find that pattern. What was the pattern again? La, mi. See if you can hear it. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Did you find that pattern, la, mi, in the song? I'll show you the answer. This time I'm going to sing that pattern, la, mi, just a little bit louder than the rest of the song. What was the pattern again? La, mi, here I go. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. So that pattern, la, mi, happens right at the very beginning of the song. Bum, bum, sounds like la, mi. Notice in that process, I didn't ask you to tell me where the pattern happened in the song independently. I did ask you to listen for the pattern, but I was sure to tell you what the answer was. If you wanted to have students generalize and find the pattern independently, then you could ask students to tell you where that pattern happens. Now, it was a bit hard to demonstrate that activity through audio only because I would typically use some kind of movement or gesture to show students where the pattern happens. For example, I might raise my hand wherever the pattern occurs in the song, or perform some kind of movement like waving my hands or tapping the pattern. Then you could ask students to recognize where the pattern happens by doing that same movement or raising their own hands when the pattern happens in the song. Another idea for recognizing that tonal pattern would be to have students chime in on the pattern whenever it happens as you sing the song. You could also have students move a prop whenever the pattern happens in the song. Maybe you move scarves with flow during the song, but when that pattern, la, mi, happens, you have students pulse, la, mi, whenever that pattern occurs, and then move with flow with their scarf for the rest of the song. Finally, a couple notes about solfege. Because the purpose of solfege is to associate the syllables with musical sounds, it's important that solfege always be performed in context. Tonal solfege should always be sung, not spoken, and it should be performed on the appropriate pitches. If you speak solfege, it loses its meaning because you're no longer associating the syllables to the musical sounds. This defeats the whole purpose of verbal association. So always be sure to sing solfege syllables, not speak them. Also, remember that solfege should act as a sign, not a symbol. As I talked about back in episode 41 when I introduced the verbal association skill level, signs are something we hear and symbols are something we see. Notation is introduced at the symbolic association level because notation are symbols. At verbal association, students should hear solfege and sing solfege, but they should not read or write solfege spelled out with letters. Now, to be totally honest, when I was teaching kids, did I occasionally let students see the symbols when they were first starting to recognize tonal pattern functions? I don't know, maybe. But I took it away as soon as possible, and I never wrote out the solfege syllables for an entire song. If you were to write out an entire song in solfege, then the syllables would essentially be acting as symbols, and we don't want symbols at verbal association. Also, when solfege is used in writing, it typically acts as a crutch for what is lacking in audiation. For example, if a teacher wrote out the pitches for an entire song in solfege syllables so that the students could play it on their recorders, the students likely would just be decoding the written symbols without audiation, using the written solfege to tell them what fingers to put down on their recorder, as opposed to truly audiating the pitches and using their audiation to play the song. So to ensure that solfege is used in a manner that supports audiation rather than replacing it or contradicting it, Gordon strongly recommended that solfege serve only as a sign and not a symbol, that we only hear and sing solfege and not see it. So that was an overview of the main skills that we teach tonally at the verbal association skill level. In an upcoming episode, I'll do the same thing with rhythm skills learned at the verbal association skill level. But before I wrap up, don't forget to send me your favorite strategy for teaching tonal skills at the oral or verbal association skill level. Maybe it's a fun pattern echoing game, or a prop that your students love that gets them excited to sing in solo, or that provides a great visual or kinesthetic reinforcement of the resting tone. Or maybe it's a game that you use for practicing labeling pattern function. Whatever it is, we would all love to hear about it. Just send a description to me via email at everydaymusicality@gmail.com, or you could record a short voice memo of yourself describing the activity and email me that file. I'm sure listeners would love to hear other teachers describe in their own words what they have found success with. So please send me your emails or voice memos. Also, a quick note from our sponsor, the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. Enrollment is open for this summer's professional development levels courses. These are 10-day courses where you can be immersed in music learning theory, spending half of each of the 10 days learning about the theory itself, and then the other half engaging in practical applications for the music classroom or studio. There are a number of sites at various places in the United States, and I'll be teaching the Level 1 Elementary General Music course at Michigan State University. That'll be in June with Cindy Taggart. It would be lovely to see some of you there. I'll link to the Gimel website in the show notes if you'd like to check out the locations and dates. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. You can email me or send me a voice memo at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and let's keep musicking every day.